Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're speaking to skill acquisition academic Dr Phil Kearney. Phil, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on, Dan.
Great to see you, Phil. It's been some time. We've been trying to arrange this. We first met several years ago at a skill acquisition convention. It was 2019 in Ireland.
2018, I
18,
think.
yeah, pre-COVID, yeah.
Different world.
Really enjoyed that. Learned loads from that conference, and so delighted to speak to you today. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Where am I now? So I am the Interim Course Director. I've been Course Director for a few years, took a step back and just covering for somebody now. So Interim Course Director of the Masters in Applied Sports Coaching here at the University of Limerick on the west coast of Ireland. It is a really nice role to have because predominantly that's where my teaching is, with coaches who have 10 to 15 years experience coming from a range of different sports with a range of different areas where they're looking to develop. And my job is to facilitate their development. So I have no idea when we go in September what exactly we're going to be working on together over the next 2 years. I will find that out. And it is that nice combination of terrifying and exciting in terms of what you do. So that's my current role. I have a number of roles around that as well. I'm involved in an organisation called Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland, which is about trying to raise awareness of skill acquisition within Ireland, obviously initially. Like many organisations around the world, I think skill acquisition it's in a really exciting place at the moment. And through my lecturing in skill acquisition, through my role at Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland, I've also been involved with Gaelic Games over the past few years with the sports science framework that they've developed, and specifically trying to develop skill acquisition within the practice of Gaelic Games coaches and coach developers and players. And so, again, that role has been something that I've been involved in on a player and coach development group for the last few years. And so that's maybe the sport that I've been working most in, but realistically, I'm interested in skill acquisition across sport and beyond sport, and have had the good pleasure to work with especially PhD students and master students across a wide range of different sports with the common idea of understanding learning, understanding skill, understanding how do we develop this to make a difference to players, to coaches. And so I'm passionate about skill acquisition. I'm very lucky to have found a role that allows me to explore that passion every day.
And Phil, as a sports psychologist, I would never ever ethically picture myself as a skill acquisition expert, but it's an area I'm so passionate about, and you've raised that word that I would always turn to, where I think there's such a commonality between what you do and what I do, and that's that word learning. Because branching off of learning are so many psychological constructs, confidence, motivation, control, commitment, and so on and so forth, attention, concentration, the list goes on. Would you think that that's a fair thing for me to say, that relationship between sports psychology and sport and skill acquisition is there's a heavy overlap there historically and in the present?
Absolutely. In terms of learning is one of the core topics of interest in psychology, not just sports psychology, in psychology in general. I would see psychology very much as the parent discipline, and skill acquisition being a focus on a particular area within psychology. Yes, we obviously draw on biomechanics and we draw on other areas as well to fully develop it as a more applied sports science. But for me, psychology is the natural home. However, I would say that, and this isn't a criticism of sports psychologists, but sports psychologists, contrary to the popular imagination of many players and coaches, sports psychologists can help in a lot of different areas. They can help in terms of the organization. They can help in terms of, as you mentioned, confidence, motivation. They can help in terms of learning. And I think it is relatively rare that sports psychologists concentrate on or have skill acquisition as one of their primary areas. And I say that not just in my opinion, but there's also some research by Patricia Jackman looking at sports psychologists in the games in Ireland very recently. And do they do skill acquisition? Yes, but it's maybe ninth or 10th out of the different areas that they work on with coaches and players. So for me, skill acquisition is absolutely, there's huge overlap. And but it's not something that sports psychologists do enough. Some do. I had the pleasure of working with Tim Holder at one point, and Tim would be a sports psychologist for whom skill acquisition absolutely is one of the strings to his
Yep.
bow. In my
Yep.
current organization, John Perry, likewise, again, some of the work that he would do would absolutely fit in under skill acquisition. And I think so. Sports psychologists can, but not many do. And I think that's really opened the door for the skill acquisition specialist, or I think in Australia they're talking more about the learning design scientist now, but that role becoming something that isn't being filled and could be filled an awful lot more.
Well, John, Tim, and Patricia, the three names you mentioned there, have all been on the Sports Site Show. So I had wonderful conversations with them. And I think it's fascinating, Phil, actually, what you said there, because it very much tunes in with my experience of my profession. And I don't know if it's because I have that coaching background as a professional golf coach, PGA golf coach for a few years, that orients me more towards skill acquisition. It sometimes feels like the natural home for sports psychs. They tend to orient towards mental health, well-being, yes, okay, mental skills for performance, but sort of the day-to-day well-being of players, and that's obviously grown in popularity and is stunningly important. But I would I don't know if I'm somewhat biased here, or I go to an extreme lens of this, but I would actually argue that player well-being in the kind of high performance environments a lot of us work in, it almost starts with the skill acquisition piece, because, and it is a strong thing to say, but because when coaches are great coaches and they're great session designers and their coach behaviors or their coaching styles are effective, efficient, efficacious, then it's not to suggest that players are not going to experience ill-being. I'm not suggesting that, but it's such an important part of the experience of playing sport for those in high performance sport. And when they're exposed to poor coaching or poor session design, or coaching styles that are inappropriate, then actually that taps into ill-being. Would what I've said make some sense to you? There's a strong relationship there, and I think, sports psychologists working more in this area, or at least contributing, co-creating things with you guys as Skill Act. I almost think that can be well-being. That's where well-being starts in these environments.
I trying to pick up the number of threads that I want to react to in that, because there are loads.
Please do go.
So yes, in terms of where you started with the consequences of poor coaching behavior, or coaches who design a learning environment that is far from optimal. I do recall a conversation with a sports psychologist talking about, I was brought in to do one thing, but actually I spent the first 6 months dealing with the fallout of the previous coaching regime. And actually, so absolutely agree that is possible. I think that, and this maybe comes from some of my background in complexity thinking and dynamical systems and how everything is integrated. So we really can't think, if you're interested in well-being, yeah, everything feeds into that,
Yes.
exactly as you described there. And it's much easier to be happy and contented if you are improving and seeing progress. And so, like, all these things are tightly interconnected. But it's also the people who should be interconnected. So that's that aspect that you said there. That a skill acquisition specialist and a sports psychologist, even if they are not working on the same things, they should be cooperating. So, if I was working with players and I came into an organization and there's a sports psychologist there who has been doing some work on imagery, to give us a very simple example, imagery in preparation for competition and for handling the step up in competition, fantastic. Now I want to piggyback on that and use those same imagery skills, but I'm going to apply them to learning as opposed to applying them to performance. But we should be cooperating and we should be much more efficient if we are looking to see, perfect, I'm gonna use the language that you are using. I'm going to build on the steps that you're using to be more efficient in what I do. So yeah, I agree with all of the above.
I love it. I love it. And we're here today. We're going to unpack more about everything to do with skill acquisition, but we're here today to talk about a new framework, a sports science framework for Gaelic games, part of which is related to skill acquisition. And really excited to unpack this framework. Can you give us a little bit of background here with relation to this framework? Where does this come from? Why does it now exist? What are the objectives here?
So the broader context is that a few years ago there was a recognition that there's a lot of sports science in Gaelic games, but it's maybe not optimal in terms of how it's being used, and it's definitely not organized. And so there was a need to try and organize sports science more broadly so as to give primarily clubs, coaches, players just a better understanding of what exists, what they should be experiencing when they interact with practitioners. And so Aoife Lane was from Athlone Technological University of Shannon. She was heading up a committee with Martin Kennedy, who was then at the Gaelic Game Association. And the remit was to try and put some structure and organize what are the different sports science disciplines, what are the key sports science disciplines, and break this down and communicate what they are and their purpose for, as I say, for club coaches, for clubs, for anybody who might be engaging with sports science. And the reason I take my time in introducing that broad picture is because skill acquisition historically has never been one of the sports sciences on that at that table. Even if you look around the world, skill acquisition is rarely one of those. We have a traditional breakdown of physiology, biomechanics, and psychology. Those are the big three. But one of Aoife's points in the first conversation I had was coaches, players, they don't meet many physiologists. They don't meet many biomechanists. They do meet strength and conditioning or athletic development coaches. They do meet psychologists. They do meet nutritionists. They do meet. Okay, so these are the applied scientists they meet. So should this framework actually focus on those disciplines? And the question was, should skill acquisition have a seat at that table? Now I'm biased. I said yes, absolutely, and this is why. So that's the broad origin, which again I'm really pleased about, and I think Ireland is just in a really nice place at the moment in terms of skill acquisition, because we have Gaelic Games framework recognizing skill acquisition as one of the sports sciences. The Irish Sport and Exercise Sciences Association has been set up, and they are also recognizing skill acquisition much more prominently in terms of their organization of disciplines. Down in Cork, Edward Collin, who you know, and colleagues Alan Dunton, Sam Germain are involved in a new Masters in Skill Acquisition. So actually right now there's this real buzz around skill acquisition in Ireland. But when I was first brought on board to try and do some organization of skill acquisition for Gaelic Games coaches, the first conversations that I had would run something like, so what do you do? Skill acquisition. Oh, very nice. What's that then? And so the skill acquisition framework for Gaelic Games, or the guide to skill acquisition for Gaelic Games, it came out of that problem. Actually, in the bubble where I live and where I'm passionate, and all my reading and thinking and talking is about skill acquisition, I know what this is, but there's an awful lot of coaches, an awful lot of players, an awful lot of clubs who don't understand what this is. And so the guide was a first step to say, actually, this is what this branch of sports science is, and this is what this branch of sports science can do for you. And I'm being very deliberate there when I say this is for players, this is for coaches, this is for clubs, because skill acquisition has something to inform and to guide at all three levels, not just the typical what is it that a coach should do. So, sorry, a bit of a longer background, but that's where this guide came from. That's the broader context. And so its purpose really, in the first instance, is to raise awareness as to what skill acquisition is, to build some excitement about, okay, there's this body of knowledge, there are these professionals that I can draw upon to help me with my practice, and then to start the ball rolling. So it's very important to stress that this framework is not an end point, this is a start point. The idea here is that we have organized and defined skill acquisition, and from here, it's a jumping off point. It's a jumping off point for clubs and players to engage with skill acquisition, for coach developers to understand how they can help coaches. It is for other disciplines, for psychologists, like we just talked about, to understand how they can cooperate. So the guide is a really broad document to try and do lots of different things over time. Our understanding is this is organizing ourselves to start from this basis.
Well, I'd love to go through this document because it's a wonderful sense-making tool around skill acquisition. And we had Ben Franks on a few weeks ago, and I said to Ben, I want when we have the conversation about ecological dynamics. I know there's many coaches, because we use these terms, many coaches out there who want the sort of 101 guide to ecological dynamics. So let's take things step by step and go through ecological dynamics. And what I'd love to do is to do something similar with you here when it comes to skill acquisition, and let's use this framework, this document that you've created as our guide, because as I say, it's wonderful in terms of its sense making step by step. So, I think the first question is the obvious one, and it's the one that opens this document. What is skill acquisition? And to speak to your point, Phil, I know there's coaches and people involved in sport around the world listening in who experienced and less experienced alike. Not everybody has the same resources and the same experiences. So there's many listening in who, won't necessarily know what skill acquisition comprises of. They know their sport very well, but they won't necessarily have heard this term. So begin at the beginning for me. What is skill acquisition?
I'm actually going to go back one step because you said something and I just want to pick you up on
Please.
it. You said this document that I have created. And just to be very clear, this isn't a document that I
Sure.
have created. This is a document that's come out of a working group. So Ed Collin down in Cork was involved. Wesley O'Brien, whose expertise is in children's motor development, was involved. Paul Kinnerk, who is both a coach and a researcher, he was involved. Carla McCabe, who's a biomechanics researcher, was involved. Molly Dunn and Donny Buckley, who are both coaches, again, coming in to keep us academics on track and grounded and sensible, were also invaluable. So it's a big team effort in terms of who's been involved in putting this document together. And we also had a host of international reviewers and a host of national level reviewers as well. So I'm a spokesperson for it today, but this is absolutely not my document. This is the credit is due to this large group who've contributed to it.
And I know many of them, and so I personally apologise for that. I wasn't suggesting that they, so well said. Thank you for that.
So back to skill acquisition. In essence, it is the science of practice. It is understanding how do we make each hour of practice as effective as possible. What does it mean when we say practice is effective? We mean that what you do shows up when you need it. It shows up on the pitch on game day. So the thing that you're working on, that you're trying to improve, how do we practice in such a way that we make the best use of the hour, the best use of the time, the best use of the activities, the best use of your interactions? If you're one coach and you've got 20 athletes there with you, that's not a lot of time per player per training session. So there's a real onus, if you want to be as effective as possible, in making the best use of all those moments that you have. So skill acquisition is the scientific study of how do we make practice as effective as possible. I liken it quite a bit for teachers, if there's any teachers listening in or any parents of pupils who are studying for exams. there are good ways to study and there are poor ways to study. You can read and reread that page, and you can spend the hour doing that and not learn a huge amount. Or you can read the page, turn it over, and try and recall elements from it. You can read the examples, you can then try and come up with your own alternative examples. There are many good ways to practice, to study, whatever we're talking about in terms of improvement. Skill acquisition is again, it's more than 100 years at this stage of people trying to figure out how do we make practice as effective as possible. And I'll just add one layer to that as well. It's traditionally, and if you look at any motor learning textbook, most of the book is dedicated to the instructor, we'll call him, and we'll park the other meanings of that term, but whether it's the coach, whether it's the activity leader, the teacher, whoever the case may be, it's about what they do. It's about the activities that they pick. It's about how they sequence those activities. It's about how they instruct, how they give feedback. It's mostly focused on what the coach or what the instructor does. And that's useful because skill acquisition has a lot to say about what that person should do to be most effective. But skill acquisition is much broader than that because the learner learns. What's the learner thinking about? What are their behaviors to make the most out of each hour of practice? So skill acquisition also talks to, and I love the term which I came across recently, how a player navigates their training session. I love that. But actually, we can zoom back a level as well. So again, most motor learning textbooks talk about one session. They narrow that focus, what happens in that one session. But the expertise literature is skill acquisition over a lifetime. And there we have different questions. We have questions about how many different sports should you play, what the balance of play and practice should be, who should you be interacting with. Skill acquisition has something to offer on all of these things. And I'll make one last point, which is that skill acquisition does not have all the answers because this is complex. Learning is complex. People are complex. People learning things, that's incredibly complex. And anybody working with adolescents, you now have learning of developing humans, complexity on complexity on complexity. It's going to be very difficult to find universal answers to situations like that. But what skill acquisition can do is it can give you some ideas, some principles, some considerations that you need to watch out for in your domain when you're working to help you make better decisions, to ultimately make the best use of your practice time.
I've written a number of things down here, Phil, that we can dive into, not least individual specificity, effective practice, obviously, player involvement in their own development, that navigation, if you like, and different forms of effective practice or skill acquisition over the course of a lifetime. But let's begin with the next, I suppose, obvious question. What is skill? I don't know if it's a daft question, Phil, but what actually is skill?
So again, this is something that we kind of open the framework with, and we spent time really trying to define this because this is the foundation. If your definition of, depending on your definition of skill, that will shape your definition of learning and the learning process, so your understanding of what it is that we're trying to learn. So it's really important to first off have a clear, and if you're talking about working with a group of coaches or an organization of coaches, so your children are moving from one age grade to the next or one level to the next, really important to have a shared definition and an understanding of skill. So ultimately, and I think this is, and we tried to be atheoretical in the document. So we tried to write this neutrally. We weren't drawing on any one particular theory because we wanted this to be something which was as universal as we could be. But I think what we did, what I think all theories agree with, is that skill is the ability to solve the problem that the moment presents. And I don't think there's any controversy in that. different theories propose different mechanisms by which people can solve the problem the moment presents, and those different mechanisms might have different implications. But actually, fundamentally, the problem is the same. The definition of skill is the same. Skill is the ability to solve the problem the moment presents. And that was echoed in, so Luke Barrett is one of our graduate students. He did a wonderful project with interviewing coaches, and he asked them that question of what is skill. One of the answers, which I really enjoyed, came from a coach who said, well, let's look at a cornerback. What does a cornerback have to do? Okay, skill is doing all those things really well, really consistently in whatever way they're called upon to do it. That's skill. Skill is doing the job. Skill is the ability to solve the problem the moment presents, whatever that problem might be. And so I think for me, that base definition, I think, gives us a really good starting point when it comes to team sport. What are the things that you have to do in team sport? You have to read the play. You have to understand where you are, your teammates are, your opponents are, how everything is evolving. So you have to read the play, and you have to adapt your movement in response to that reading. And it's a continuous cycle of reading the play and adapting your movement. People outside of Ireland might not recognise this, but most people in Ireland will recognise when I say David Clifford's goal from the weekend just gone, where he rounded the keeper and put the ball in the back of the net. There's your perfect example of reading and adapting and reading and adapting. Every movement he made was an adaptation to the previous movement. There's no isolating the movement. You're not saying that he kicked the ball beautifully there. Well, the only reason he kicked the ball in that way was because of what happened just before it. What he did, and what the goalkeeper did, and what the opponents did. So in any team sport situation, skill is not an isolated moment in time. Skill is the constant adaptation, constant reading of the game, and constant adaptation, and cycles embedded within cycles. Different theories give you different mechanisms as to how that occurs, but they all are interested in the same thing. How do we develop people who can read the play and adapt their movement to consistently solve the problem that the moment presents?
In sports coaching circles, we've often broken down coaching practice into four basic components: technical, tactical, physical, mental/psychological, and if we're going to dive a bit deeper, /biopsychosocial, right? How does what you've described relate to those four components? Is it that those four components, am I going off on a flight fancy and this is something completely different? Or would you, if I was to say those four components are constantly pressuring skill, that would be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think it's a fair thing to say. I think in the same way, to go back to this idea about well-being that you talked about at the start, and we said, it's not one thing, it's integrated. There's lots of bits actually come into this. Skill is the same.
Okay.
The skill that you perform will of course be dictated by your physical attributes, will of course be dictated by your reading of the play, will of course be dictated by some of the psychological aspects. Again, what does the movement look like when you're terrified versus when you're not? There are these lovely experiments I remember watching as an undergraduate. I think Dave Collins actually might have been involved. Sounds like the kind of thing that he might do, where he got, and I might be remembering this wrong, but I'm thinking about maybe army recruits, and he had them walk across a plank which was 6 inches off the ground, and then walking off a plank which was whatever 20 feet and 6 inches off the ground. The task is the same. The task is exactly the same, but the movement isn't the same. And so this is where understanding that skill is, it I'm going to use the word emerges, but that again, I'm using that. There's different mechanisms by which you can link into that, but skill emerges from the influence of all these different factors. And if that's your understanding of skill, well, then that has consequences for your design of practice, because if the interaction of all these things results in the skill that you see, well, then your practice has to involve the interaction of all these different elements. And it's a classic piece that, again, different theories have recognized this for a long, long time. You know, we together with Ed Cullen, Alan Dunton, and Ollie Logan, we wrote an article last year responding to a really nice paper by Ricky Lindsay and Michael Spittle called The Adaptable Coach. But in our response, we highlighted that information processing theory is often described as having this emphasis on isolated practice. But we quoted from Martin Buch's classic textbook on information processing theory from the 1970s, stating that if you are looking to develop an adaptable performer, isolated is not going to be a huge amount of use. That it has some use, but as soon as possible, you need to be putting them in situations where, again, they are responding to lots of different influences and they are having to respond, to read and respond, read and adapt. That's at the essence of what information processing theory was saying in 1970s. So I think, again, your understanding of skill as an adaptable, as the ability to adapt, to read and adapt, is at the essence of then how you design practices. Okay, so my practices have to be reading and adapt.
I love that idea of reading, play, adapting movement, reading, play, adapting movement, and that constant cycle, constant stream of those two working hand in hand. I just want to, because you've alluded to effective practice there, and I do want to jump onto that next, just dwelling slightly on these components, because I think this is an important question, because it almost feels that there's been, within the historical context of sport, this term technique tends to be used a lot. And I talked about 4 components: the technical, tactical, physical, psychological. But that word people talk about great technique, and it almost seems to be used synonymously with skill or to replace skill. I mean, where do you come from there? Technique is obviously influencing skill, but it feels like there's a lot of practitioners, a lot of coaches out there who might use that term instead of skill.
Yes, and I think this is a really important point that actually Alan Dunton made in a recent conversation, that that we need to be very careful that we understand what practitioners mean by the terms that they use, not to assume they might say technique, I say skill, but we're actually talking about the same thing once we get the definition behind those. And so this is one of the pieces about how do you, as a skill acquisition specialist, how do you engage with an organization? Well, the first thing, and this comes back to Tim Holder actually, the first thing you do is you get into that environment and you watch and you listen and you observe and you try to understand and you try to empathize, to use the word Georgia Eskew was using in some of the work she's been doing in Australia in terms of skill acquisition. Before you do anything, you've got to really understand what this environment is that you've been invited into. And that can take time. And part of that is understanding what people mean by different terms. Skill and technique is an obvious one. For me, if I go back a stage, almost the biomechanics. Is the biomechanics important? Rugby, we've got the Lions tour on at the moment. Rugby is a wonderful example to see the importance of biomechanics. If you have a player who is standing too tall when they go into a ruck, they're going to get knocked out the back end of it because they're not in a position which gives them the opportunity to apply force effectively in either attack or defense. Your positioning is really important to influence how effective you can be. So is there such a thing as this person was in a technically good position or technically good movements in that instance and that person wasn't? Yes, absolutely. As I say, you look at any contact, is somebody well-grounded, a solid base of support? That's oftentimes going to give them a real assistance when it comes to that moment's performance. The mistake that's often made is to narrow that vision down a little bit too much, to say that, oh, that this is the one technique, or this is the one way that I'd like you to pass a ball or to hit a rock. Because skill is taking these technical principles and adapting them to the situation that you find yourself in. Because every situation is different. Every situation is different. Skillful players are those who can adapt their fundamental principles of technique to meet the needs of the situation. And the best players are those who consistently adapt their technique to meet the needs of the situation. So it's not true, it's not fair to say that there's no such thing as technique, but I think there's been and again, it's understandable. People try and simplify things. One of the ways we deal with complexity is we try and find a simple solution to that. The danger is that we find solutions that are overly simple. I think one of the overly simple solutions is, oh, this is the technique. If we get this technique right, then it'll work. I really like, again, going back historically, Anne-Marie Gentile described stages of learning. And the first stage of learning she described as getting the idea of the movement. Not getting the movement, getting the idea of the movement. Not getting the technique perfect, getting the idea of what it is that you're trying to do. Once your learner has the idea of what they're trying to do, then your more isolated practice, you're stepping out of the game to look at something, then that activity has done its job and you can put them back into the game. But the idea is first, what are you trying to achieve with any, not that you always need to practice or to step out of the game, you don't, but when sometimes you do, its purpose is not to groove technique. Its purpose is not to get a precise, specific, perfect technique, because our biomechanics friends have shown us time and again in every sport that doesn't exist. Variability is king. Adaptability is what you get from variable movement patterns. So the key message really is what you're looking for is the ability to adapt technique to the needs of the situation. That's what we're after. And I think in fairness, most coaches who have spent some time thinking about this, that's their understanding of skill as well. They might use technique as the word, but that's their understanding of it, I think. But they might not use they might not use the language, the same language. And that's why for us, it was really important that we spent this time, that we added this definition at the start of the document. This is what we mean by skill. So that when we talk about skill, this is what we'd like people to talk about. These nested cycles of reading the play and adapting your action. And it's not once, it's not reading this play and adapting your action. It's a one-off thing. No, it's this cycle after cycle that are nested of reading the play and adapting and reading and adapting and reading and adapting. That continuous nature of it is a really important part of the definition of skill.
I love that idea of getting the idea of the movement. It sends me back to being a golf coach and considering the sensorial experience of the people I was coaching. When I think of the idea of the movement, I'm thinking about the visuals that they are receiving and what they see and what they kinesthetically feel and what they aesthetically experience in their mind. I love that idea of the idea of the movement. And I almost wonder if that notion can transfer across to the idea of reading play, as in getting the idea of what you're seeing.
Absolutely.
Kind of making sense of the patterns around you. I remember the former Dutch international soccer player, Ruud Gullit, talking about football being a game of recognizing patterns. And again, I just think almost like a heuristic of getting the idea of reading play as well as getting the idea of experiencing movement. No question, you just throwing something at you.
Yeah. So it's a completely different interaction with a learner when you ask them, again, let's talk about the reading the
Yeah.
play. You know, what are you seeing? I have no idea. I love the first person perspective on soccer
Mm.
matches. You know, and when you see, geez, there's so much going on, and I'm a complete novice soccer player, and if you put me in a five-a-side context, my former colleagues at Chichester will testify, the worst five-a-side soccer player that you can come across. Um, I haven't a clue. I haven't a clue what's going on. I haven't a clue what I should be looking for. I have no idea as to what's out here. To interact with me as a coach would be very different to interact with a player who does understand. Now, okay, maybe they're not moving in the right way. Maybe their timing is a little bit off. But when you ask them the question, they go, I saw that, Dan. I saw he moved. I was just slow to react to it, but I saw that was there and I saw that was there. Okay, that's a very different interaction that you should have with that player who has an idea of the movement. They know what they should be doing. They know where they should be going. They have an idea. Okay, we can even separate that out even more. We've got a player who knows what they should be doing but doesn't know how to do it, versus another player who knows what they should be doing and knows how to do it. They can't quite do it consistently yet, but you can leave them alone because they know what they should be doing and they know how they should be doing it. And it's a case of, yep, you're sorted. You just need to keep going. You'll get there. You've got the information that you need. You know what to do. You know how you should be doing it. Call me if that changes. But you've got all the ideas you need. Another player, they might know exactly what they should be doing, but they've no idea how to do it. Okay, that's maybe some help that they need. And then you have a third player who has no idea what to do, full stop. That's different help that they need. And so, yeah, that's whether it's golf, you know, what are you feeling? Dan, I have no idea. I think it's this, I think it's that, I have no idea. Okay, let's step out and let's explore. And our job is to get you to understand what you're feeling and to tune into. Because again, this is one of the ideas we often have in say ecological dynamics. The emphasis is often on tuning into the information in the world around you, which is true. There's lots of information in the world around you that you can tune into. But that's not the only source of information when you move. There's also information from the kinesthetic flow of information in your body as you move. And that's information you need to tune into as well. So actually, you know, tuning into information, tuning into the flow of information can be external information, the flow, the affordances around, but you also need, in the development of coordination in the first place, to tune into the flow of information within the body. And I'm sure you've met lots of golfers for whom they're not tuned in. And so actually helping them to tune into that flow of information in the body is a first step to get them to understand what's happening, to allow them to then progress to closer and closer to the game.
You're making me think of, and I don't want to take this down a completely different path because I think we're in danger of doing so, but I think given that we're both geeks in this area, let's do so for a little bit, because I still think this is coming around to what I want to talk about, which is effective practice and you know, and what's in your framework with relation to effective practice. But it's making me think of the work of Timothy Galway, going back to the 1970s. First wrote In a Game of Tennis, then moved on to In a Game of Golf, and I think he was one of the first authors, although he wasn't a traditional sports psychologist per se.
Yes.
Obviously, everything that he wrote about was psychological, but I mean, in many respects, he wrote a lot in that book about skill acquisition, and he was using a scaling protocol, a scaling of 1 to 10, to help golfers become more attuned, to pay attention to become more attuned to their movements, in order to adjust. But I think his argument was very much, as you're kind of alluding to, And what I've experienced is golfers who are kind of out there just to play golf and just to try to hit the ball well, but they're not attuned to necessarily what their shoulder motion is doing. Are they rotating 90 degrees? Are they shifting their weight to their right foot? Are they, all the things that you might think about to strive to hit great shots as a consequence of the kind of technique that we might be speaking to, but you've got to help them become aware of those kinesthetic feelings, the aesthetic, visual, and the visuals throughout the swing. You're making me think of that there to actually develop skill, increase awareness, whether that's external awareness, the external affordances, you might say, but also the internal or even the proximal external awareness of where the club is in the golf swing, or the internal sensations.
So again, Galloway's books. I have Inner Game of Tennis. I have the Inner Game of Golf, and they're fantastic to make you think. And I love those, ideas coming from practitioners to really make you think. But the other part for when we talk about this awareness, when we talk about developing, tuning into the body movement, Galway's emphasis was very much on that being subconscious. This is not you understanding that, well, this needs to be at 90 degrees and this needs to be at 87 degrees and this needs to... No.
Yes.
So when we talk about awareness, we're talking about more general feeling of the movement. When we're talking about somebody who's tuned into their movement, it's not necessarily that they're actively controlling or consciously controlling all the elements. No, it's oftentimes simplifying the task so that, I'm doing that, and that feels balanced, that feels strong, that feels smooth, that feels... Oh, and look, the ball is going straight. Or in my case, the shot put is going straight, or it's going at a nice angle as opposed to going too high or too low. So it's very important, I guess, for listeners to understand we're not talking about people being really conscious of all the minor details, because sports psychologists will tell us that has all sorts of other consequences down the line, potentially. But definitely this tuning in, this development of awareness, and this importance of the general feel of the movement is huge in terms of athlete development. And then, just what's the kind of practice, to come back to that idea, that helps us develop that awareness? For me, one of the most underappreciated and simple to implement tools is contrast training. So old way, new way is the classic, started with children learning to write in Australia, but brought into sport by a sports psychologist, Hannon. Obviously, Dave Collins has used it. It's integrated into the 5A model from Carson and Collins as well. So this idea of, okay, humans learn really well by compare and contrast. So if you make a mistake, and this is, old way, new way is, you're trying to change, okay, you're slicing the ball off to the right. Okay, next time I want you to slice the ball to the right, bring it way off to the left, and now see if you can go down the middle. Because if all you're trying to do is hit it down the middle and you've no reference points, it's very difficult to understand what that feels like, the awareness. But the idea of deliberately slicing it to the right, further to the right, hit it to the left, further to the left, is you're giving yourself reference points. You're allowing yourself to compare and contrast. And in athletics, we use compare and contrast. Do the correct action, do the incorrect action, do a big action, do a small action, do a fast action, do a slow action, do a right-handed action, do a left-handed action. Compare and contrast is just such an effective way to enhance learning by developing awareness, by developing that ability to tune into what the body is doing. It's underutilized because, again, there's one of these beliefs, these popular coaching myths. You can't practice the wrong way. Don't do it wrong. Don't even look at that golfer. If you look at him, you'll catch what he's got in his swing. And it's this, no, we shouldn't be afraid of errors. Actually, there are times when we should be amplifying and embracing errors to help us compare and contrast to build these reference points in order to accelerate our development. Sorry, that's a digression, but it kind of links onto that idea of how do you use practice time more effectively. And sometimes building in that compare and contrast can be much more effective than the same amount of time spent hammering on the same thing over and over again.
No, I love it, and you're evoking pictures in my mind, or you're creating pictures in my mind of me on the range, whether it was playing or whether it was coaching, because I was a big advocate of exactly what you're speaking to, in order to help people build awareness of the feelings in their swing, and to help them to a certain degree organically start to experience ball control and control in the swing. Effective practice. You're speaking to this already, but take more of a helicopter view here. Maybe you might mention some principles. Maybe you might talk about transference or fidelity or whatever language you prefer to use. But give me some ideas here around effective practice and skill acquisition.
Yeah, so I think there's a principle which is, for me, the foundational principle in skill acquisition, which is that performance and learning are not the same thing. Performance being what you see in the moment in front of you, how well the player is doing in this activity. Learning being how much sticks or how much transfers into the competition situation. Because there are, and again, skill acquisition, it's complicated. The literature is definitely not as nice and neat as it's sometimes portrayed as being. But there are definitely some, and actually I showed this. This was an interesting one I did at the conference, with a little bit of a maths trick, where there are definitely ways you can get people to perform really, really well, really fast, really quickly. If you get someone to do the same thing over and over and over again, they generally very quickly get very good at it, and it's looking lovely. Doesn't mean they're learning anything. It just means you've rigged the situations of practice to artificially boost their performance. And so how do you know whether the training that you've designed, the support that you're providing, is encouraging long-term learning or is artificially boosting their performance? You can't tell in the moment. The only way you can assess that is by, okay, at the start of the next session, we're going to do this activity again unprompted, and let's see how much sticks. Or let's have a look in the game. Are we seeing this come up in the game? So there's for me a fundamental principle. We are looking not to artificially boost performance, and you'll know you're artificially boosting performance if you're listening to this and you're saying, yeah, I've been complaining about how, lads, girls, you could do that on Thursday in training. Why am I not seeing it here on Saturday in the match? Odds are it's how you're practicing. And this again is part of this conversation between skill acquisition and psychology. Someone's inability to deliver in the competition situation absolutely could be due to a lack of psychological skills in terms of managing pressure. But equally, it could be due to poor practice design. Practice design which is artificially boosting their performance in practice, but not transferring over to competition. And so if I see the scenario where you've got a player who's kicking 80% of shots in training and 50% in the game, I wouldn't jump to that being a psychological issue and call the sports psychologist. Besides which fact, I'm sure there's loads of sports psychologists listening who are going, that's not sports psychology. Do not call us in response to a short-term issue like that. We've got to do some experiments now. We've got to work out what's happening. I've got 80% in practice, 50% in the game. Is that because of a skill acquisition? It's a practice design issue. Or is it a psychological skills issue? Is it a conditioning issue? Is it a fitness that's being shown up in the game, which is at a high intent? There's three possible solutions straight away. We need to do some experimentation, ideally collaboratively if we have the possibility. If you're a coach on your own, This is why I have incredible admiration for coaches. They are people who are trying to draw together all of these different sports science disciplines and apply them to help people develop and help people achieve and fulfill, experience happiness through sport, if you want to simplify things. But it's a very difficult thing for them to do. So, what are the core principles of effective practice? Number one for me is, we're not artificially boosting performance. What we are doing is we are doing things that stick. That might be practice which is a bit more challenging. It can't be too challenging. It can't be under challenging. We've got to try and get that just right. That's the challenge point. And I will reference any interested listener to an excellent episode of the Sports Psych Show previously, which addressed the challenge point with Nicola Hodges. So I think those would be two to start off with. Certainly, performance and learning, two different things. Understand that, and you know what you're looking for, and it can help judge the quality of your practices. And number two is getting the challenge just right. Very difficult thing to measure and understand, but there's some good guidance around challenge point where we can start thinking about, okay, well, what does that look like?
Practice to perform and practice to learn. There's a difference in session design, and challenge point is a useful resource for that. When one thinks of coach behaviour, are there specific things that coaches might engage with from a behavioural perspective that might be seen when engaged with practice to learn versus practice to perform?
So, two ways I want to respond to that. First, I really like that distinction you made between practice to learn and practice to perform. I think that's where we start when we explore the quality of a coach's practice design. What's your intention here? Is your intention, practice to perform, or I've heard it described as practice to excel? Okay, we're going to try and mimic the performance environment as best we can in the practice environment. Now, I know some people say you can't do that, right? You can't prepare for the All-Ireland football final in 2 weeks' time with 80,000 people going absolutely nuts in this incredible cultural as well as psychological event. I don't buy that. I've seen lots of really good work that people have done. And a former mentor of mine, PJ Smith, said, we sent people to the moon. We couldn't practice that. So we can prepare for things that we cannot possibly mimic. We've a history of doing it as a race. So there are certainly things we can do to prepare. Practice to learn. I think we can subdivide that again. So again, I've heard lots of different ways of this being described, but practice to learn, practice to challenge, practice to win was one recent description I've come across. So practice to win is your practice to perform or practice to excel. It's mimicking the competition. Practice to challenge is what they described as, okay, well, you've got the idea that we're working on here. You know what you need to improve. And now we're working on your ability to adapt and deliver that. But what happens when you actually don't know what you need to work on? You don't know what to improve. Or maybe the coach knows it, but the learner doesn't properly understand the concept. So again, this was Paul, I'm going to forget his surname now, but he was a kayak coach and he presented at the Expertise and Skill Acquisition Network conference, which is actually coming up in September in September 2025, which is if anybody's interested in skill acquisition and is a kind of a practitioner / coach in the interaction of that space, it's definitely worth checking out. But Paul presented there and he talked about practice to explore, practice to embed, and practice to excel. Practice to explore was his kayaker who was losing time on upstream gates. Okay. Why are we losing time on upstream gates? The first thing we need to do is figure out what the problem is. We don't know what the problem is to practice. Once we figured out what the problem is we need to practice, then we can move into the practice to learn, as you called it, or practice to challenge, as it's been described elsewhere. But actually, there's a whole other phase, which is practice to explore. We got to find out what the problem is. What do we need to work on? So, number one, it's really important that you've got a clear intention for your practice. And I really like, again, whatever the phrases are, but is it learn, challenge, win? Is it explore, employ, excel? Whatever the phrases are, but do you have different types of practice? Okay, that's great. That's one which we need to engage with. Then you asked about coach behavior. Sorry, I imagine these are some of the longest answers you're getting to questions, but coach behavior you asked
Perfect.
about. That's really complicated because learning is complex, people are complex, and there are many different ways in which we can construct a challenging situation for somebody to practice in. And if we take challenge point to its extreme, the idea of challenge point is that we need to get someone to experience the right level of challenge. But there are lots of coach behaviors, there are lots of practice design aspects that we can manipulate to influence that challenge. So I already talked about repetitive practice. So if I do blocked practice, doing the same thing over and over again before moving on to something else, that reduces the challenge. If I randomize, you're constantly changing the task you're doing, that elevates the challenge you experience. If a coach gives you lots of feedback, that decreases the challenge. If a coach holds back on the feedback, maybe asks more questions, that elevates the challenge. So now we have two coaches. One coach is using lots of blocked practice, but also lots of questions to try and probe your awareness and really specific and detailed questions. So the blocked practice is lowering the challenge, the questions is elevating the challenge, and maybe it hits the Goldilocks point where it's just right. A second coach has got random practice, which is elevating the challenge, but is also providing lots of feedback, which is lowering that challenge, and maybe they also hit the Goldilocks. Now, these two coaches look nothing alike. But their athletes are both experiencing just the right level of challenge through these different interventions. So, what does skill acquisition tell us? There are no simple answers. It is really important when you're working with a coach to understand why they are doing what they are doing. What's the thought process here? There are multiple ways at which you could arrive at an effective session, which is just the right level of challenge for an individual. And so, yeah, there's no simple answer to that. It depends on what they are thinking. It depends on, and they have to be able to rationale. And so when I interact with coaches, I'm not that interested in what they do. I am much more interested in why they do what they do. And I'm much more interested in the sum of the parts. So what does this all add up to? In skill acquisition, I think we got it wrong for a lot of years because we were asking which is the right type of practice? Is it random or blocked? Which is the right type of feedback? Is it immediate or is it delayed? And these are the wrong questions because those manipulations are just means to get at what we really want, which is what the learner is doing. We're interested in the level of challenge and a cognitive perspective, the level of processing from an ecological perspective, the information, the relations that an individual is engaging with. It's not about which is better, random or blocked. We're interested in what is the influence of random or blocked and everything else that's going on what's happening for the learner. That's what we need to be paying attention to in order to get the practice environment just right. And that's complex, and that takes time, and that requires you to sit and observe and to ask questions and understand the terminology and all these elements that we've talked about. So there aren't any quick wins, but it's fascinating.
I want to be respectful of your time because I know you've got a hard stop, but I'll beat myself up if I don't ask you this one last thing, and I want to return back to something that you said at the beginning of the show with relation to all these topics associated with skill acquisition, and that's skill acquisition over the course of a lifetime, because we can think about skill acquisition or acquiring skill for the very youngest of human beings with relation to sport right the way through to the very oldest. So apologies for doing this to you because we don't have long to go, but just some sort of a helicopter viewpoint of this for those listening in. How can we consider skill acquisition over the course of a lifetime? And I appreciate we could probably do a whole episode on this, but in a couple of minutes, a few comments on that.
It's a great question because coming back to the skill acquisition guide that we've been roughly basing this conversation on, one of the misconceptions about sports science is that sports science is for high performance. Sports science in general, skill acquisition in particular, has as much to say to guide the coach of 6-year-olds in their first experience of organized sport as it does 26-year-olds heading to the Olympics, as it does 66-year-olds trying to gain the confidence to sustain engagement in a new sport. So again, it absolutely is a lifespan piece. When we are talking about skill acquisition over that time scale, I like the idea of play and practice, which has been introduced. I'm trying to find a way to do this neatly.
Yes, sorry.
I love the idea of play and practice. So play, Jankote, being the more informal engagement, it's for immediate enjoyment, often very imaginative. Practice, it's more structured. But what I really like, when you trace back where that has come from, there is an educational psychologist, Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote in the early 1900s, and he talked about the rhythms of education. And he didn't talk about play and practice, he talked about freedom and discipline, but we can take them that they mean the same thing. For any learning environment, and again, any learning environment, 6-year-olds, 26-year-olds, there should be some freedom and there should be some discipline. And the reason he talked about the rhythms of education, he used the analogy of a drum beats. So you've got discipline, which is the slow, heavy, booming drum beat. And you've got freedom, which is the tap, 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 quick, tap, tap, tap. And he said, it's not a case that children, it's all about freedom, and adult high performance, it's all about discipline. He said, yes, obviously, if you zoom out on the big picture, children, it's more about freedom and less about discipline. And adults, it's more about discipline and less about freedom. But actually, when you zoom in closer, there is freedom and discipline in every session. There should be. And I love the analogy of when I'm watching coaches or watching athletes practice on their own, I'm listening for those rhythms. Am I hearing the right mix? Sometimes that big booming discipline drum should be booming louder. Sometimes it should be the tap, tap, tap that I hear much more of. But when I'm watching your session, when I'm watching you practice, am I hearing the rhythms just right? Am I hearing the balance? Am I hearing the flow? Am I hearing not just a consistent rhythm, but it's a flow, more discipline, less, more freedom, less. And I think that for me is when I look at lifespan, that's a useful analogy that I bring to it. What for this person at this stage in their development, what should I be hearing in terms of the rhythms of freedom and discipline within their practice that I think is the right fit for them at this moment?
Love it. Phil, absolutely fantastic. Gripping stuff, really, really interesting. How can people find you, follow you, get in contact if that's possible, and potentially find out more about these sports science frameworks, especially the skill acquisition framework?
So in terms of contacting me, the email address is probably the easiest, philip.kearney@ul.ie. You can also find me on X at Kearney_Phil. I consider myself too old to engage with any other social media, although LinkedIn, I think, is a bit more appearing there. And in terms of these documents, if you search for skill acquisition framework for Gaelic games, they should come up. They're all publicly available. There is a talk that I've given on YouTube, and there is slides available with that. And then obviously the framework itself. As I say, this framework is not an end point. It's a starting point. I'd love it to be not just a starting point in Gaelic games, but a starting point for other sports to have conversations. And as I say, that the expertise in the group was in relation to Gaelic games, but they work in golf and rugby and volleyball and all sorts of other sports as well. So I think this is something which has potential to be a useful stimulus to get people thinking and talking across a range of different sports. And it'll be a success for us if it does so.
Phil, thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.